We're going to get on with this evening's talk. My name is Peter Bonilla. I am the executive director of the MIT Free Speech Alliance. We are an independent, alumni-based, and supported nonprofit promoting free expression, viewpoint diversity, and academic freedom in the MIT community. Our website is mitfreespeech.org. We welcome members from the whole MIT community and those from without the MIT community that are interested in free speech and higher education and those kinds of issues. Um, Before we start, just a quick thank you to our co-sponsoring organizations. First, thank you to MIT Concourse. It is great to have such a great collection of MIT Concourse students here. They always give such great energy. The room just always seems to become more bouncy and optimistic the more of them you put in there. So I'm always so happy to be in a room full of these students. Um, Thanks also to the Heterodox Academy campus community here at MIT. If you are MIT faculty and interested in joining, do please look up Alex Byrne and Brad Scow, who are with us this evening. Thanks also to our friends at the MIT Open Discourse Society. If you're a student and looking to bring a heterodoxy of views to campus, look them up as well. And again, if you're any of those demographics at all that I just mentioned, we would love to have you in our membership at the MIT Free Speech Alliance. So look us up. Feel free to talk to me. I'm around all evening. We love being able to partner with MIT student and faculty organizations to bring interesting and compelling speakers to campus. So look us up. We're happy to take every opportunity that we can to work with you. Uh, and now it is my pleasure to introduce this evening's speaker. Musa Gharbi is a sociologist and assistant professor in the School of Communication and Journalism at Stony Brook University. He earned his PhD in sociology from Columbia University and is a columnist for The Guardian, and his writing has appeared in the New York Times, The Washington Post, The Atlantic, and many other publications. He is the author, most recently and pressingly for this evening's discussion, the author of We Have Never Been Woke, The Cultural Contradictions of a New Elite. I very much enjoyed the book. I spent the first part of my new year reading through it. Really looking forward to the discussion. Really happy to have him here. So everyone, please welcome Musa Gharbi.
Thank you so much for that introduction. All right, can people hear me? All right, we're good to go. I'm just gonna pour some coffee. Sorry, so I'm not low energy. Just take 1 second here. All right. So I'm Musa Gharbi, here to talk about my book. So I'll start by talking about who is the we, and we have never been woke. The main subject of the book is this constellation of elites that I call symbolic capitalists. Symbolic capitalists are people who make a living on the production and manipulation of symbols and data and ideas and rhetoric. Like a shorthand, if you can think about people who work in fields like finance or consulting or science and technology or law or human resources, education, and so on, chances are, if you're in this room, you're either a symbolic capitalist or you're aspiring to be one. One of the things that's unusual about symbolic capitalists as a group is that if you look at who in America is most likely to self-identify as anti-racist, as feminists, as environmentalists, as allies to LGBTQ people, and so on, it's us. Symbolic capitalists are overwhelmingly affiliated with the Democratic Party. From the beginning of many of our professions, we've defined ourselves in terms of altruism and serving the common good. So for instance, to use my own professions, journalists are supposed to speak truth to power and to be a voice for the voiceless and to educate citizens to be good participants in democracy. And professors are supposed to follow the truth wherever it leads and to tell the truth without regards to anyone else's political interests and economic interests and so on. From the beginning of our professions, the extraordinary pay that we receive, the extraordinary autonomy that we have compared to most other workers, the unusual prestige that we enjoy compared to most other workers, we've justified these things through altruism and the common good. We said, you should give us this freedom, this autonomy, this pay, this prestige, not for our own sake, but because if you give us these things, it will be to the benefit of everyone in society, including and especially the least among us. And so over the last 50 years, there have been these changes to the global economy that have really favored symbolic capitalists and the symbolic professions. Now, given the ways that we like to, the ways that we talk about ourselves and what it is that we do, given the ways that we tend to think about the social world, our political affiliations, our moral beliefs, then what you might expect and what we promised would happen is that if you give people like us more power and influence over society, you'd see shrinking inequalities, you'd see growing broad-based prosperity, you'd see increasing trust in institutions because of all the good work that we're doing, long-standing social problems would be ameliorated, and so on. And over the last 50 years, as the economy has been reoriented around us and our professions, as we have indeed gained a lot more power and influence over society, we haven't seen what you might have expected or hoped. Instead, we've seen growing inequalities, increasing institutional dysfunction, increasing institutional distrust, growing affective polarization. Long-standing social problems have persisted and in many ways grown worse. And so the core puzzle that the book is trying to wrestle with is basically what's going on here? Why do we see the world we actually see instead of the world that we might have promised, that we promised we'd see, the world we might have hoped for if people like us were given more influence over society? Now, most of us recognize that the world we live in is very far from the world that we might have desired or imagined, and we have these kind of go-to narratives for why that is. These are narratives that before I really got involved with this project, these are narratives that I myself subscribe to. If you would have asked me who's to blame for various social ills, I would have said those damn Republicans represented by the shadowy figure in the MAGA hat, or the millionaires and the billionaires represented by the cartoon man with a big bag of money, ha 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 ha, ha, laughing at other people's. Okay, so that would have been my story about kind of why things are going awry, who's responsible for various social ills. And that is the predominant story we tell. There's just one problem. Actually, there's a lot of problems. So let's start with those damn Republicans. So one of the things I realized as I moved from the small town in Arizona I grew up in to the Upper West Side of Manhattan, I was confronted with this immense amount of suffering, just incredible amounts of human suffering, like I had never witnessed before. Suffering to a degree that you have to grow kind of numb to just to live your daily life and go about your daily routines. And if you look at kind of statistics about New York City and New York State, kind of bracketing away from my own anecdotal experience, well, another thing that I witnessed that I talk about in the book, I'll just actually add, is there's this kind of racialized caste system in cities like New York, where you have these disposable servants who watch your kids, clean your house, take you wherever you want to go at the push of a button. And it's people from particular racial ethnic groups that consume these services, while people from other racial and ethnic groups are providing those services. And this is just taken as normal and appropriate and just kind of the natural way that society operates. This is not how society operates outside most symbolic economy hubs. But put a pin in that. So as I started conducting research for the book, drawing beyond my own anecdotal experience, you can see a bunch of things that are really interesting and disturbing. So if you look at the state level for New York has the third largest economy in the nation, behind California and Texas, has one of the largest populations in the country. 1 out of every 13 residents of the state of New York is either a millionaire or a billionaire. But also 1 out of every 7 residents of the state falls below the poverty line. So it has some of the, one of the highest levels of state inequality in the country. In terms of schools and education, New York contains not just 1, but 2 Ivy League universities, Cornell and my own alma mater, Columbia, um, according to, despite this concentration of wealth, despite these prestigious institutions, New York State also has some of the highest racial gaps in employment and income and homelessness and labor participation. Almost no matter how you slice it, they have some of the most severe racialized inequalities in the country. And they're one of the worst states in the country for social mobility as well. And you see a similar picture, in fact, a worse picture, when you zoom into New York City in particular. It's a key hub for the entire world for a lot of symbolic industries, finance, consulting, law, HR, publishing, you name it. 1 out of every 24 residents of the city is a millionaire or billionaire. It has the largest concentration of millionaires and billionaires in the country, one of the highest in the world. Nearly 1 out of every 5 residents, though, an even larger share, fall below the poverty line. 18% of people in New York City are poor. It's one of the most diverse cities in the country. It also has the single most racially segregated school districts in the country. And it's the city in America that's seen the largest population declines because huge swaths of people find it unsustainable and undesirable to live here. And as I'm kind of thinking about why is this? How can there be this huge concentration of wealth, these really powerful, influential industries paired with this immense amount of suffering and poverty? It's not that there's not the resources to deal with the poverty and the suffering. There's plenty of resources. Well, who's to blame for this state of affairs? Well, I'll tell you who's not to blame. It's not those damn Republicans. So here is the New York City Council. As you can see, it's almost exclusively Democrat. Here's our state legislature representatives, 2-to-1 Democrats. The mayor of New York City is a Democrat. The governor of New York City is a Democrat. Both of our federal delegate senators are Democrats. If you look at our House delegation, overwhelmingly Democrats. There's not really a story that I could tell about how those damn Republicans were responsible for the things that I was observing in my local milieu. And New York isn't unique in this. If I analyzed Boston in the same way, I'd see the same kind of thing. Huge amounts of wealth and really influential institutions, huge amounts of human suffering and inequality, including dramatic racialized inequalities and so on, paired with representation that looks pretty similar to this. So put simply, the GOP was not the main problem. If aliens came down to Earth and abducted not only the orange man, but everyone who has ever voted for the orange man in the 2016 election, in the 2020 election, and in the 2024 elections, anyone who has ever pulled the lever for Donald Trump, if they just disappeared from planet Earth, many of the problems that I observed in my milieu would continue completely unchanged. Nothing would change, because it's not Republicans who are driving these. They're being driven in communities that are almost exclusively Democrat, in institutions that are dominated by Democrats and liberals. In fact, given the insane amounts of wealth and cultural capital that are consolidated in cities like New York City and Boston and other symbolic economy hubs, it's actually well within our capabilities. If we wanted to, we could radically upend the distribution of opportunity and wealth in this country without worrying about the Republicans at all, solely by leveraging the communities that Democrats control with basically one-party rule, the institutions that Democrats dominate with basically one-party rule. It's completely within our power to upend the distribution of wealth and opportunity in this country if we really wanted to, in a way that Republicans actually couldn't do much about. But that's not what we choose to do. So what about the millionaires and the billionaires? Well, one of the things that's striking is that, since Occupy Wall Street, there's been this really tight focus on the top 1%. This narrative, we are the 99%. So, the kind of super rich are responsible for all the world's problems, and the rest of us are just suffering under their boot. There's a bunch of problems with this framing. First, if you just look at the distribution of wealth in the United States, for instance, the top 1% of Americans control 26% of America's wealth. That's a hugely disproportionate share. 1% controls more than a quarter. But it's not the case, if you'll notice, that the top 1% control most of America's wealth. The top 1% don't control anything near a majority of America's wealth. Well, what happens if you zoom out? What if you look at the top quintile, the top 20%? That would include the millionaires and the billionaires. It would also include the upper middle class. Well, then you can account for 71% of America's wealth. Another way of saying this is that 80% of Americans have to make do with 29% of this country's wealth, because the top 20% just gobble up the rest. Now, one thing you'll notice, actually, is that percentiles 2 through 20 control much more wealth than the top 1%, almost twice as much. And so if we tell this story that focuses just on the top 1%, we conveniently miss who holds the lion's share of America's wealth, how they leverage it, who benefits from it, and how. In fact, as Richard Reeves showed in his book Dream Hoarders, if you want to understand a lot of things, from declining social mobility to growing inequality, you actually can't explain a lot of these social phenomena by only looking at the actions and behaviors of the top 1%. For almost any of these things, you need to look at the top 20%. And in fact, almost regardless of how you slice society, whether you look at the distribution of wealth and opportunity along the lines of education, whether you look at across the geographical lines, whether you divide it by profession, whether you look at economic sector, almost any way you slice the data, symbolic capitalists are the primary beneficiaries of, in the contemporary social order, we're the primary beneficiaries of many of the inequalities that we condemn, and we're some of the primary drivers of those inequalities as well, as I show in the book. And in fact, another reason why it's important to expand the scope beyond the top 1%, in addition to the fact that, again, this narrative of we are the 99% is a really, really, really convenient narrative for wealthy people to hold. It allows people with healthy six-figure salaries with $1 million in assets and so on to go, oh, I'm just an ordinary Joe. I'm just part of the 99%. It's just me and Waffle House guy in the same boat together, and the problem is just Jeff Bezos. Like, that's a kind of story. There's no way that telling that story helps the person who works at the Waffle House. Their life isn't, it's a story that's really convenient for people like us to tell. It's a kind of narrative that benefits rich people who just don't happen to fall in the 1% to absolve ourselves of blame. And you can see the problems with this deflection when you pay attention to like how stuff actually happens. So even when you want to look at the things that the millionaires and the billionaires and the multinational corporations do, and you just stop and think, well, okay, well, how does that stuff actually happen? You can see pretty clearly, pretty fast, that it happens with us and through us and couldn't happen without us. So there's a great book, for instance, by Anand Giridharadas called Winners Take All. The argument that Giridharadas lays out is that the millionaires and the billionaires and multinational corporations, in their myopic pursuit of maximizing wealth, they create and maximizing profits, they create all of these social problems. And then they use these charitable donations to foundations and so on to kind of paint themselves as heroes, as the solutions to the problems that they themselves created. It's a good book. You should buy it. Buy mine first. But one of the things that's striking about this kind of a story If you just focus on the millionaires and the billionaires and the multinational corporations, like if you look at like how does this mystification process that Jared Herodotus describes, where the people who create social problems paint themselves as a solution, how does that actually happen? You can see that symbolic capitalists do every single thing in this process. So are the millionaires and the billionaires administering their own nonprofits through which they're laundering? No, that would be us. Are they writing their own PR to help absolve themselves of social problems and paint themselves as a solution when they make these donations? No, that would be us. Who is it that writes the puff pieces? Who are the journalists who write the puff pieces after they make these donations, helping them launder their reputation? Oh, well, that's us too. Who is it that's doing the paperwork and laundering the money? Well, that's us too. Every single step in the process that Jared Herodotus describes, the millionaires and the billionaires aren't actually doing anything. We're the ones who are doing the things. And so if you only look at the millionaires and the billionaires, it's actually impossible to see how power actually operates, who actually wields it, and in the service of what ends. We don't just enable these things on behalf of the millionaires and the billionaires. It's not like we're just helpless cogs in the machine. We profit immensely from our participation in these things, just like alongside the super rich people that we condemn. And as it relates to those millionaires and billionaires, it turns out that, if you look at who are the richest people on, say, planet Earth or in America, symbolic capitalists dominate. So here you have the richest 10 people on Earth, according to Forbes. I just pulled this up. Recently, this is a real time. So these are the 10 richest people on Earth as of now. And one thing that you'll realize, well, there's a few things that jump out. One of them is that of the 10 richest people on Earth right now, 8 of them are Americans. But the next thing that you'll recognize is that the overwhelming majority of these millionaires and billionaires made their wealth through their symbolic professions. You have companies like Microsoft, Google, Berkshire Hathaway, Oracle, Amazon. In fact, every single one of the Americans, who are 8 out of 10 of the world's richest people, all of the Americans, with the partial exception of Elon Musk, are symbolic capitalists. And if you just zoom in at America and you look at the 10 richest Americans, literally symbolic capitalists all the way down. And maybe you're thinking, well, no, but look, I see Jeff Bezos up here. He's not a symbolic capitalist. He's the guy who sends packages to my door, right? Like, that's not symbolic. My package is real. The thing about it, a lot of people misunderstand Amazon's business model entirely. So Amazon.com doesn't make money by sending you packages. In fact, Amazon loses money on most of their transactions. They sell things below MSRP. The shipping costs that they incur are usually less than the shipping costs they charge. They lose money on most of the things they send you to the store. Well, how do they make money then? The reason that Amazon makes money, the main thing that they do, is collect your data and sell ads to advertisers. That's the main way that Amazon.com makes money. It's not in a package delivery, it's not a merchandise delivery business, it's a data collection and advertising business. And in fact, Prime Video works much the same way. They spend more typically on licensing content than they generate in subscriptions. The main way that Prime Video makes money is by selling you ads and collecting your data. And in fact, even both of those things combined are not the main way that Amazon, parent company, makes money. The primary revenue generator for Amazon is their AWS data analytics processing and collection services. That's the number one earner for Amazon.com. Another way of saying, for Amazon, the company, another way of saying this is that Amazon is not a package delivery company. It is primarily a data and advertising company. In the same, Jeff Bezos earns his money in the exact same way as Mark Zuckerberg. Facebook is also primarily an advertising and data company. The only traditional capitalist on the board, if you want to look at the richest people in the world, the only American on the board, or if you look at the richest Americans, the only traditional capitalist on the board is Elon Musk. You know, Tesla, he makes his money through Tesla, which is an auto manufacturing company. He has a shipping and logistics company, SpaceX. He has a minerals and extraction company, the Boring Company. But even Elon Musk, you know, he got his start, his first hundreds of millions. He earned those through two symbolic capitalist ventures, Zip2 and PayPal. And then if you look at where he's investing his money now, where's his primary areas of focus? He's got a UX company, Neuralink. He's got a telecom company, Starlink, lots of links. He took over Twitter, now X. He has this kind of janky AI thing he's doing. So even Elon Musk is the exception that proves the rule. If you want to understand contemporary oligarchs, if you want to understand the American aristocracy, actually, you need to look at the symbolic professions. The rich, the millionaires, the billionaires, the top 1%, they're us. We are them. And we're not just rich, we're powerful too. I see some young people in the room who are probably too young for Schoolhouse Rock. So just as a reminder, if you haven't had this lesson yet, the United States has 3 branches of government that have these different roles. I'm going to walk through them briefly. So let's start with the judicial branch. So symbolic capitalists, we have one entire branch of the government that's just ours, the judicial branch. 100% of people who work in the judicial branch are symbolic capitalists. And the law is very, very, very important if we want to understand almost any of the social problems that we're preoccupied with. As Katharina Pistor emphasized in her book, The Code of Capital, capital is literally a legal entity. It's a product of the law. If we want to understand growing inequality, if we want to understand why some people are able to, and so on, it's the law that you have to look to. And similarly, Steve Tellis has a great book called The Captured Economy, which focuses on how the rich and the powerful and multinational corporations and so on leverage things like regulatory capture in order to preserve and enhance their elite status and kind of lock out competitors and so on. So if you want to understand a lot of the social problems that we're preoccupied with, the symbolic capitalists, again, are the place that you need to look. And again, if you look at who holds power, we literally control one entire branch of the government. What about the legislative branch? Well, that's us too. According to an analysis by the New York Times, for instance, looking at members of the House, more than 70% of House representatives were former white-collar workers. In the Senate, it's even higher. Only 94% of House members have college degrees. In the Senate, 99%. So if you want to look at Congress, who runs Congress? Well, that's us too. We are the Congress people. We are the Supreme Court. What about the president? Fun story there. Every single Democratic nominee since Jimmy Carter has not only been a symbolic capitalist, they've been one type of symbolic capitalist, lawyers. Every single successful Democratic nominee has been a lawyer. And then even if you look at the Democrat nominees who failed, lawyer, 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 rip Al Gore. Bless his heart, a journalist, lawyer, lawyer. Pretty much all of the Democratic nominees in modern history have been symbolic capitalists. All of them except Al Gore have been lawyers, whether they've won or lost. And you might be thinking, okay, well, there's 2 political parties in America. What about those other guys? Well, if you look at who are the most influential Republicans in modern history, you got Nixon, lawyer, Reagan, the Gipper, Hollywood guy, Hollywood star. If you look at Mittens Romney, finance and consulting. And then you got the Vice President, J.D. Vance, who's a whole symbolic capitalist sampler platter. He's the best-selling author. He's the finance bro. He's a lawyer by training. He does it all. He does all of the symbolic professions. And here you might be thinking, yeah, okay, well, you got the VP, but there's this other guy, been hearing about. He's kind of a big deal. He's got this hair thing going on. What about Donald Trump? What about Donald Trump? So the interesting thing about, so Donald Trump also made his money primarily through the symbolic professions. You might think, well, that can't be true. He's this construction guy. But actually, most of his construction businesses failed spectacularly, as Forbes showed. If Trump had just taken the money he inherited it and just put it in the S&P 500 and never touched it, he would have had a lot more money than he did as a result of his construction businesses, which were often losers, and he went into bankruptcy multiple times. As the New York Times illustrates well in this story, the reason why Trump is wealthy today, despite the fact that his actual construction businesses, traditional capitalist businesses, failed, is he secured his wealth and status primarily through television, and then The Apprentice, and then appearances in movies and commercials, and by licensing his brand. So these are all symbolic. He made most of his money. The Orange Man as well made most of his money in the symbolic professions. This picture at the top, by the way, is Trump went to a WWE match, kind of slapped Vince McMahon, and then the head of the WWE, and then shaved his head alongside of a wrestler, shaved Vince McMahon's head. This is the president of the United States. God bless this country. All right, so even Donald Trump is a symbolic capitalist. And so we dominate all three branches of the government. The judiciary is us. Congressional people, overwhelmingly us. The president's us. And those are just the people, the visible people calling the shots. But as my colleague at Columbia, Gil Ayal, illustrated in his book, The Crisis of Expertise, unelected, non-transparent, and unaccountable experts play a large role in shaping public policy through advisory bodies, through expert testimony, through structuring policies on behalf of lawmakers, and so on and so forth. And as Ayal argued, the kind of growing scientization of politics is one of the main drivers of the growing politicization of science. And so it's not just the case that all the public faces of politics are symbolic capitalists, but even the people behind the scenes are overwhelmingly us too. In fact, especially people behind the scenes are us. So we control a large and growing share of the wealth, including the millionaires and the billionaires. We're the people calling the shots. Another way of saying this is that when we pay attention to how systems and institutions actually work, when we look at who empowers the politicians, who are the politicians, who empowers the millionaires and billionaires, who are the millionaires and billionaires, and so on, it's with us and through us that all of this stuff happens, or in the words of billionaire Taylor Swift, it's me, hi, I'm the problem. It's me. That was for my daughter. Okay. So one of the problems that symbolic capitalists have is, even though we're elites, and even though we're often quite elitist, it's like hard for us to really process that information. And part of the reason for this is because, again, a lot of our professions were defined in terms of confronting the elites and holding them to account and acting as a check on power. And so it's really hard for us to understand ourselves as the elites and as the powerful. You can see this tension in journalism, for instance. It's a profession that was created to, again, be a voice for the voiceless and so on. But if you look at contemporary journalists, 95% of them have college degrees. And as growing numbers of journalist applicants have had college degrees, then where you get your degree from matters more and more. If you look at like the New York Times and the New Republic and outlets like that have higher concentrations of Ivy League graduates in the Forbes 500 list, or the Supreme Court, and so on and so forth. They're intensely concentrated. on people from the Ivy Leagues, and this creates a problem for our profession, journalism. If you're supposed to be holding the powerful to account, well, that's a little bit harder to do when the powerful are your classmates, your college buddies, your exes, maybe your current spouse, when they're your neighbors, and so on and so forth. And so there's this kind of block that we have about understanding ourselves as elites because we define ourselves against the elites. And in many respects, some of our social justice aspirations also blind us to the role that we play in generating and profiting from social problems. As I show in the book in chapter 6, there's all this research in the cognitive and behavioral sciences that show when you're in a situation where yourself and your colleagues and your institution are all affirming these social justice goals, you actually become more likely to behave in unethical ways, but more convinced that you can't possibly be making decisions on the basis of things like race and gender and sexuality. So in some ways, the kind of social justice orientation of our environments not only blinds us to social problems, but makes us more likely to engage in misbehavior without being able to see our actions for what they are. More disturbingly, we often use social justice discourse to justify inequalities, to point at the people who are the losers in the prevailing order and to say that they deserve their loss, they deserve their suffering. Oh, you're falling behind? Oh, you don't have, you feel like you don't have power or control over society? Oh, you're being censored and silenced? Oh, you're suffering from poverty? Well, guess what? You deserve it. You're a racist. You're a sexist. You're a white. White privilege discourse is really interesting. I'll close on this. So on its face, discourse about white privilege is egalitarian. Like the idea is, if you sensitize white people to the ways that they have unearned advantages on the basis of their race, that this might lead them to engage with non-white people in a different way, behave more egalitarian, and so on. In practice, there's empirical research on this. When you teach people about white privilege, it doesn't cause them to think about non-white people in a particularly different way. It certainly doesn't cause them to treat non-white people any differently than they did. The main effect, empirically, the main effect of teaching people about white privilege is it causes them to look at poor whites and to think they must really deserve their poverty. They were born with all this privilege. You were born white. You were born on third base and you're poor? Well, you must really deserve your poverty. Teaching people about white privilege causes them to dismiss poor white people and to view them as deserving of their suffering. Now, this is a very convenient view for elites to hold. In fact, a plurality of poor people in the United States are white. And so if you subscribe to an ideology that allows you to look at the lion's share of poor people and think you owe them nothing, in fact, they have more than they need, more than they deserve, you can take more from them, they deserve it. That's a very convenient view for elites to hold. It's a kind of ideology that on its face is egalitarian, but in practice serves to justify inequality. And that's just one example of many as I walk through the book. As Randall Collins emphasized in his book, The Credential Society, from the beginning of our professions, they've been intimately bound up with these claims. Our claims for power and status have been really intimately bound up with our bids for more resources and more autonomy and more pay and more status. In fact, this tension that we see with white privilege and how it operates has defined our professions from the get-go. A lot of our professions, actually, pretty much all of the symbolic professions, on the one hand, define themselves in terms of altruism and serving the common good, but on the other hand, were really elitist, really mistrustful of ordinary people, including and especially poor people and religious and ethnic minorities. For instance, in Augustina's new book, Raised to Obey, and actually in a lot of literature, if you look at public education in the United States, you had people like Horace Mann who encouraged public education to help develop people's human capacities and to kind of educate people to be good participants in democracy, all these great noble goals. They were also, at the same time, part of the same package for why public education was important, was because you couldn't trust poor people, ethnic minorities, and religious minorities to raise their own children. They had the wrong values, they had the wrong ways of thinking about the world. They were backwards, they were savage, they were stupid. If you left these children in those people's hands, we'd get more dummies, more evil people, and so on. And so you had to take these people out of the hands. You had to take these children out of the hands of the poors and the darks and the religious minorities in order to make them into reasonable, good, decent citizens. That kind of racism, religious bigotry, elitism was baked into the project of public education explicitly, like not like theoretically. They write papers like, here's why you need to do this. In the same breath that they're saying, we need to do this for all of these good, noble reasons, they're also saying we need to do this because those people. And so this kind of tension, this cultural contradiction, as I call it in the book, these cultural contradictions have been baked into the symbolic professions from the outset and continue to define them through the present. My last point, for real this time, is that, okay, so when you see these contradictions, that we profess to support these egalitarian causes, but we also profit immensely from these very social problems that we condemn, and so on. It can be really easy to think, well, you know what the problem is? The problem is that a lot of symbolic capitalists must just be cynical or insincere. And there's this kind of move in the discourse where, for instance, if you can show that someone has an interest in believing something or advocating for something, then you go, ha 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 ha, you've been exposed. Cynical. This is kind of the take. I think that's a really bad way of thinking about thinking. So there's all this research in the cognitive and behavioral sciences that shows that how we think about and perceive the world at a very fundamental level is geared towards advancing our interests and furthering our goals. And this is actually necessary in some ways. I can explain why in the Q&A. I'll try not to go on that tangent. But if we take that literature seriously, and I think we should, then there's not actually a tension in believing something sincerely and using it instrumentally. If you have a reason, if it's in your interest to believe something, you're going to be more likely actually to believe it sincerely, more likely to try to get other people to believe it too. So the problem is not that symbolic capitalists are insincere or cynical when they say that when we say things like we want the poor to be uplifted, we want the people at the margins of society to live lives of dignity and inclusion. We're not lying. When people were crying after George Floyd died, that wasn't just a performance. It was a performance, but it wasn't just a performance. The problem is, the sincere commitment to egalitarianism is not our only set of sincere commitments. Symbolic capitalists are also sincerely committed to being elites, which is to say, we think that our perspectives should count more than the people checking us out at the grocery store. Our priorities should matter more. We think we should have a higher standard of living than the people delivering our packages from Amazon. And what's more, we want our children to reproduce our own standard of living or to have an even better standard of living. And these tensions and these commitments are in fundamental tension. The desire to be an elite, the desire to be an egalitarian. You can't actually be an egalitarian social climber. It's a contradiction in terms. And so what I argue in the book is that when these sincere commitments come into conflict, as they often do, it's our desire to be an elite that often ends up winning out in transforming how we pursue social justice, leading us to pursue it primarily in ways that don't cost us anything, don't require us to risk or change anything, don't require us to change our aspirations or the aspirations of our children. In fact, the big fantasy that symbolic capitalists have had from the beginning of our professions, as if we can just tax people like Elon Musk enough, if we can just tax them hard enough, we can solve all the world's problems. In practice, that's tough to do. As Reverend Collins illustrated in the Credential Society, at the beginning of the symbolic professions, there were two big changes that happened. There was the passage of the income tax, which was successfully defended in the Supreme Court. And then there was the creation of big philanthropy, modern philanthropy as we understand, modern philanthropy. As a result of these two developments, the income tax, philanthropy, there was this massive transfer of wealth from the Gilded Age elites downwards. Sounds wonderful. Okay, but where did the money go? As Collins illustrates, the primary wealth transfer that actually occurred during that period was from the super rich to the upper middle class. Symbolic capitalists took from the rich and we gave to ourselves. And there were some programs that were created. There were some ways in which ordinary people were made better off, but not nearly as much as one might expect or hope given the sheer amount of wealth that was transferred down. The problem with just thinking that we can soak the rich and solve these problems is that it's actually hard to just take money from the rich and give it to the poor. Instead, it usually ends up in institutions that we control, and we eat until we've had our fill, and then we just let the crumbs fall where they may. This has been a consistent problem throughout US history, throughout world history. It's one of the main reasons that communist revolutions, for instance, often don't work out. And so while it might be good to tax the rich, we just can't explain how social problems come about and persist, who benefits from them, or what we can do to solve them if we only look at the millionaires and the billionaires. I'll leave it there. Thank you for your time. Here's my Substack, my website, and so on. Thank you.
People hear me? Okay. We have time for questions and answers, and I've got the microphone here. So people want to start getting their hands up. I'm going to start with this gentleman in the back here. I'll bring it back down to the front, but we have time and we want to hear your questions. So
I've been trying to formulate this as a question, but I think it ends up being more of a critical comment, which I mean with all respect.
Yes.
I have a problem with some of your terminology. I think a couple of words strike me as being misused or inexactly used in ways that I think, unfortunately, reduce the depth of the insights that you provided us tonight. Uh, the key word is altruism. I have a problem with the way you've used it because my understanding of altruism is that it innately involves one's own personal resources, not redistribution of somebody else's resources. And that folds over into your use of egalitarianism. And I think a more refined use of those terms would even deepen the insights that you've provided tonight.
Yeah, I mean, so a classic, it's definitely true that the classic understanding of altruism is like, altruism is putting skin in the game, right? Altruism is, I use the term altruism in egalitarianism mostly to reflect kind of how we understand ourselves. So if you ask most symbolic capitalists if they're egalitarians, they define their project as egalitarianism, even though, again, in practice, they are elites, they're elitist, but we think of ourselves as egalitarian. And similarly, our professions are defined in terms of altruism. And in fact, if you ask a lot of symbolic capital, if you press them on this point, they say things like, oh, well, I dedicate my whole career to, for instance, if you ask journalists, they'll say, oh, I dedicate my whole career to telling these stories of people who are, whose perspectives might otherwise be missed and so on. So they would describe their job as the way they dedicate their lives as an example of altruism. There's a lot of problems with that, not the least of which being that, in fact, journalists don't do a great job of covering people who are not elites. I'll make a quick point on this and then I'll stop talking. There's this essay that haunts me by this guy, Bertrand Cooper. It's called Who Gets to Create Black Culture? And one of the things that Cooper talks about in this article, he says, after George Floyd was murdered, there were all of these demonstrations for him. Nancy Pelosi donned a kente cloth and took a knee. HBO, New York Times, Washington Post, all of these people, never-ending coverage of, well, I guess it did end, but intense, widespread coverage of George Floyd and his life and so on. Cooper asks, okay, imagine a world where George Floyd didn't die. A living George Floyd, what if he wanted to write for the Washington Post? What if he wanted to do something on HBO? If he wanted to be on HBO? Would he have been able to? No, hell no. George Floyd didn't have a college degree. He was a poor person, and so a working class person, and so on. The perspectives of people like George Floyd are completely absent in places like the New York Times and so on and so forth. We only cared about George Floyd when he was publicly murdered and became a symbol that we can manipulate in our struggles over power and status. There's something sick about that. But the point is, living people like George Floyd, who are not useful symbols to us, we don't care one whit about them. Not only are the perspectives of people like George Floyd not included in mainstream media outlets, for instance, but even sometimes when we're forced to confront the perspectives of normie black people, we react very negatively and kill the messenger. So there's this journalist, Lee Fang, who worked for The Intercept, and after George Floyd was killed, he went out and interviewed ordinary black people about their views, about Black Lives Matter and so on. And one of the people he interviewed said something like, you know what trips me up? People get really upset. Like if I were to be killed by a white police officer today, people would be upset. It would be on the news, all of that. It's great. But if I got killed by another black person, no one would care. No one would care. It wouldn't even be a story. There's something messed up about that, he said. Fang put up that perspective, along with others. And there was a lot of blowback, because when we were forced to confront views of normie black people that we found distasteful, we punished the messenger. Lee Fang was fired from The Intercept for sharing that perspective. And so yeah, there's this, but if you ask journalists, we would tell you that we do a great job, that this is what we do. We're a voice for the voiceless. We elevate these people. So we're these great altruistic people. In fact, I've encountered this talking to journalists. So I agree that what we're doing in practice is not altruism. We're not actually making risks. We're not actually making sacrifices. We don't actually put skin in the game. But that's how we understand ourselves. And so I just tried to argue within people's own sort of self-understandings and frameworks. But there is a sense in which if I had stepped outside and maybe said like, hey, it might have been in some ways kind of a more, yeah.
Hello. Okay. First, thank you so much for your time and everything. I found this incredibly insightful. I just wanted to say that I appreciate you coming here tonight and it being late and everything. I wanted to ask, what is the upshot of this? What is the forward-facing perspective once we acknowledge this? If we take your conclusions for granted, it would seem that now we have this picture of inequality as a perennial human question that has existed since forever and seems to be persisting well into the future and exacerbating at an increasing rate. What do we do as symbolic capitalists, or what would you prescribe as the solution?
Yeah, so as a spoiler, um, I end the book on a willfully unsatisfying note. I just don't do that. I decline to provide readers with that catharsis. Like usually how books go is there's like 6 chapters describing a problem, and then the final chapter is like, and here's my 12-step program. Here's the 5 policies that you should pass. And like, one, those chapters usually, it's kind of usually the crappiest part of the whole book, honestly. But then more importantly, I wanted to have readers kind of sit with the weight of the things that I didn't want to provide the illusion of easy solutions, and in part because there's this real hunger. I'll give an example. I did a talk on the book at this place in DC, Politics and Prose, this bookstore. I finished the discussion, and this kind of group of older white ladies kind of made a beeline for the microphone. And then they each kind of did this kind of 2-minute build-up to their question, talking about how committed they are, all the good work that they do, until they got to their question, which was like basically, so we're good, right? I'm good, yeah. Um, and when I declined to give these people this catharsis they were looking for, one of them literally screamed at me. Screamed, well, what would you have me do? And I was like, lady, I wouldn't have you do anything. I wrote a book on the history and political economy of the knowledge professions from the interwar period through the present. I'm a sociologist. If you want someone to tell you how to live your life, there are people for that. There are therapists. There are priests. There's a whole, there's ethicists. There's this whole constellation of other folks out there who can tell you. And so part of it too is kind of respecting my lane. There are public policy people. There are ethicists. There are all sorts of people who are kind of better suited than me to speak to the what to do about it problem. And then also, I just really want to resist this impulse because there's this big appetite for someone like me to become a secular priest for kind of anxious liberals. And it's not my bag. I'm not into that. But I think this question about what to do is important. It's the question, right? But yeah, I don't have a kind of clean, easy answer. And Princeton wanted me to write an answer. They really wanted that chapter with it. And so I wrote a version of the book where I did this. I kind of, here are some thoughts that derive in a kind of natural way from this book about how, but it seemed weird to me. It seemed like a non sequitur to have spent 300 pages looking at the history and political economy of the knowledge professions and then going, here's 12 steps to effective social justice advocacy. It just seemed like a complete non sequitur. It didn't make any sense. So I struck it. I went to war and I won. but again, I do think it's an important question. It's like the question. I just refuse to give an answer to it. Yeah.
Linda, I saw your hand, so I'll.
Yeah, maybe this just follows up a little bit on that. I think okay. Okay. I feel weird with it. But you sort of started the talk by by pointing out how Democrats in New York, are all those in political power are all Democrats. But then you showed later that symbolic capitalists sort of control all 3 branches. It's true of Republicans as much as Democrats. But Republicans aren't woke. So I guess what I'm wondering then is, so is there not, it seems as though there's some specific connection with symbolic capitalism and wokeism, but then what about the
Well,
Republicans? I guess
yeah,
I'm
yeah. Well, so one of the things that I do in my book is I do a symmetrical analysis of. So symbolic capitalists are overwhelmingly aligned with Democrats. We are overwhelmingly liberal and so on. But there are some right-wing symbolic capitalists. They're a minority, but they punch above their weight for a bunch of reasons. Um, but one of the things I show in the book is there's actually a lot of symmetry between how right-leaning and anti-woke symbolic capitalists think about the world versus their progressive peers. For instance, right-leaning symbolic capitalists also tend to think that these symbols and rhetoric and images and words, struggles over these things, are super important, so important, world historically important, that the kind of bread and butter issues of normal people should take a back seat to them. Um, they engage in politics in largely the same ways. I'll give an example. So in a lot of anti-woke spaces, for instance, you'll hear people say things like, Ibram X. Kendi, boo, that guy sucks. You know what? I am a big supporter of the Martin Luther King approach to racial justice. And it's like, okay, well, are you organizing or participating in MLK-style movements to address poverty or racial injustice or against war or any of the other things that Martin Luther King stood for? Well, no, they're not. They're sitting on their armchair criticizing the woke people and using that as a stand-in for actually doing something in the world. So they're not actually doing anything different from the people they're criticizing. And so, yeah, I think there's actually more symmetry than difference, both in terms of how they think about the world, how they talk and approach morality and politics, and so on and so forth. And in fact, you can see this with the recent regime change that's happened in the United States. So a lot of normie voters are really annoyed at progressives. For instance, for a lot of schools after George Floyd was murdered, a lot of progressives focused on changing the name of schools. So it was Robert E. Lee School, and now they make it Rosa Parks School. This kind of stuff annoyed a lot of normie voters, not because they have a deep and abiding passion for Robert E. Lee or they hate Rosa Parks. Like they don't mind the direction of the change. The thing that annoys people is that this is the thing that we're expending capital on at this moment. Like this isn't our top concern for our community, for our school, for my kids' education. You want to focus on this trivial crap about the name on the front of the building? Okay. So Donald Trump comes into office. What does he vote right out of the gate? Let's name the Gulf of Mexico the Gulf of America. Let's name Denali after I forget what president. It doesn't even matter. And Pete Hegseth is like, well, all these bases, they got rid of the Confederate names. I'm going to change them back. And that's a double loser because you're not only focused on this kind of symbolic crap instead of addressing people's real problems, but you're going the opposite direction of that most people would even want if you were going to focus on this symbolic change. It's not like there's some kind of large swing constituency in America who thinks that the Confederates just haven't been given their due, and it's really important to change their name back or something. And so, there's not a big difference between how right and left-leaning symbolic capitalists approach politics, think about the world, prioritize these things. There's a way that you could understand the kinds of politics they're engaging in as woke, even though they don't talk about anti-racism and stuff. They do a kind of right-wing version of that.
Hi, thanks. So I'm trying to. So why is it that symbolic capitalists matter at all? Like they're not the ones with guns. They're not the ones who own the means of production. They're not the ones who, like, I'm trying to imagine, like, you would say, in a kind of old school way of looking at the world, you would say, here's the capitalist. He owns the means of production,
Yeah.
and that matters. And here's the guy with the gun, and be careful, he's going to kill you. And
Well,
so, but the symbolic capital is kind of in many ways, like if you forget about the world that we live in right now and we go back a little bit in time, Like if there is a movie, there is like an old school capitalist who takes advantage of this very smart guy who graduated from college to do the accounting in a smart way, and then kills him at the end so that he doesn't tell anybody else because it doesn't matter really at the end,
Yeah,
right?
I mean, those are movies that people like us make, of course. So, um, and I
But
think,
in a way, kind of going back in time, though, it's not like it was always like this,
well,
right?
no,
It
but
became a prominent class,
yes,
and
this is
yeah, I want to know why.
yeah, this is the point that I make in the book, is that there have been these major changes to the global economy over the last century, and especially over the last 50 years, that have completely changed who has power in society, who benefits from social problems, and how. And so, yeah, if you look at uh, the traditional, let's stick with the traditional capitalist distinction. Again, one, the kind of the industries where people are producing physical goods and services to people, the traditional capitalist industries, they're becoming a more marginal part of the economy, no matter how you slice it. If you look at total GDP, again, if you pull up who are the richest people in the world, who are the oligarchs, who are the millionaires and the billionaires, it's increasingly us, not them. Um, if you look at, in fact, even symbolic capitalist companies control most of the real economy. So there was a study that was done, for instance, so consulting for, if you want to look at who gets laid off from a plant and why, it's often, it used to be the plant boss would sit there and he would have these arbitrary powers laying people off and blah, blah, blah. Now it's increasingly companies like Bain Capital, consulting and finance companies that make these decisions about who's hired and who's fired, even in traditional capital industries. Um, we're the ones calling the shots. Um, and then, again, if you look at the guns, we have a structure for now in the United States where it's a civilian-controlled military. And if you look at, again, who are the civilians who are controlling the military, who are telling the guns who to aim at and who to shoot, it's symbolic capitalists. Barack Obama, when he was droning Yemen and all of that, he was a law professor before he was the president of the United States. He won a Nobel Peace Prize and also said he's good at killing people. Great. Um, you know, Joe Biden, Kamala Harris, Donald Trump, these are all people who made their fortunes and achieved their status and fame through the symbolic professions. So there's actually not much about the world today that we can explain if we just focus on the traditional capitalists and not symbolic capitalists. We actually miss most of who has the wealth, who has power, how it's exercised, and so on. If we just focus on the traditional, one of the big innovations I tried to make in this book is precisely on this point, because I think a lot of social science especially has been like really oriented around focusing on traditional capitalists to understand political power and wealth and things like this in a way that I think is just not actually a good way, not mapped on to the reality that we're living in and that we've been living in actually for like 50 years now.
So, well, I'm kind of have like an observation following up on a point you made about kind of like a solvent class of service workers in New York City. I thought that was a really eye-opening point, and it made me think that really that holds true not just in like New York City, but also really like almost anywhere in life. Kind of a working class people really are almost a servant class in a negative way, like especially on like college campuses. I've noticed like the service workers like in dining halls or cleaning rooms, and your point about those people overwhelmingly being minorities is really interesting and eye-opening.
Thank you.
Do you want to expand on that further?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I'll offer two. So one of the things, so I start the book with this scene that I observed, with a series of scenes that I observed moving from Columbia to Columbia University. So the thing I was doing immediately before working at Columbia University was I was selling shoes. I was a shoe salesman in the mall at Sierra Vista, Arizona, the town I grew up in. And so I go from this small military town, being a shoe salesman, to being an Ivy League intellectual in New York City. And it was cultural whiplash for a bunch of reasons, especially because I moved there right before the election of Donald Trump. And so the book opens, spoiler, the book opens with this disorienting set of scenes I observed so for instance, after Trump was elected, a lot of the students at Columbia were upset. They thought, well, the rich and the powerful are now going to be better off than ever. They're going to crush the little guy underfoot. The poor and the disadvantaged are going to be dragged down. And it's like, well, even in a world, let's just take that at face value as being true. The good news for you, Columbia student, is that you're the rich and powerful. You're at Columbia University. This is an elite school, which is to say it's a school by and for elites whose primary purpose is to mark people as elites and to legitimize their elite rule on the basis of merit. That's one of the main reasons that this organization serves in society. But the students who were at Columbia, and the faculty members for that matter, did not understand themselves to be elites. In fact, they understood themselves to be especially vulnerable to Trump and his regime, to be victims, to be the little guy. And so they demanded all of these accommodations because they were just too distraught to take their tests, too distraught to do their homework. And the administration, of course, obliged. And there were a few things about this that were striking to me. One is that, again, there was this whole mess of other workers around the students, the janitors, the groundskeepers, the security guards, the cafeteria workers. There was no movement for those folks to have a day off, to have accommodations, to have a pay, increases in their pay and their salary. The students were focused on themselves. And this is striking because whereas the students, again, were overwhelmingly from wealthy backgrounds, and the ones who didn't come in wealthy would leave wealthy. Here's me, six-figure salary, was a shoe salesman before that. That's what Columbia is there for. But the janitors and the groundskeepers and so on don't make the same kind of money. They're disproportionately likely to be immigrants and minorities. And they were completely invisible to the students in their calculations. And not only were they invisible to the students and the faculty, for that matter, again, not just a student phenomenon, not only were they invisible to the students and faculty, but you didn't notice, if you paid attention to the groundskeepers and the security guards and the janitors, they just showed up the next day and did their jobs. They weren't here like, as they were scrubbing rich kids' poo out of the toilets. They just showed up the next day and did their jobs. And this juxtaposition was sobering. There are a bunch of things like this. Like when I got when I got admitted into the PhD program of Columbia, I was given a stipend of almost $40,000. And this is more money than I had ever made in my life doing real jobs. Like I did freight for a while, things like this, real jobs. Full time. Never made as much money as I made as a PhD student. But a lot of my colleagues looked at this generous stipend and were like, this is trash money, this is garbage money, what is this? Money for slaves? And this is because they looked at the money their parents were making, they looked at the money that tenure-line faculty at an Ivy League school were making, and they saw they make a lot less than that to be a student. And they were like, oh, I'm being shafted. And again, like it's not clear why a PhD student should make as much as, say, a tenure-line faculty member or their parents who are mid-career professionals and whatever. Set that to the side. There are all these other people around them. It wasn't just me for whom $40,000 was more money than I ever made. If they walk through the neighborhoods and look at, again, who's driving them around with beep, 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 oh, the disposable chauffeur, who is it that's feeding them, and so on. Almost all of these people they interact with outside of Columbia. I say interact with in a very loose sense here, make less money than them. And the only way that they can think of themselves as poor is because they just have no idea how other people live. It's the only reason that they could think of that as trash money to be a student. Last thing I'll say about this. Within the symbolic professions, you have a lot of households. Most households are two earners. In fact, this is one of the things that drives inequality between symbolic professionals and other people is we're more likely to get married, we're more likely to marry someone who's a dual earner person who also has a college degree. There's this aggressive assortative mating. So you usually have households with 2 six-figure incomes or more or less. Okay, so ask yourself, in a world where you have two parents working, both the husband and the wife, if you're talking about a heterosexual couple, are both working, there's still all of this domestic labor that needs to be done, especially if you have kids. Someone needs to, say, feed them. The house needs to get cleaned and so on. How is this happening? How is this domestic labor getting done? You might think, well, maybe the bros are stepping up and the men are feminists after all. Symbolic capitalist men self-identify as feminists. So you might think, well, maybe what's happened is there's just been this radical change in the allocation of domestic responsibilities, and men and women carry equal shares, and that's how they're able to get this done is by divvying up the domestic labor equitably between the partners. That is not the case. There has not actually been there's been a marginal, not huge change in the amount of domestic labor that men do. So how is this possible? Well, the main reason it's possible is because symbolic capitalists just hire other women to do the, quote, women's work. Other women watch your children, other women clean your house, other women take care of the old and the sick and take care of your pets and cook your meals. And so there has not been they've just outsourced this gendered labor to other women, and the way that they're able to make a profit off of having both people work despite buying all of this extra domestic labor, the way that they're able to profit off this second salary despite buying so much more labor, is that they shaft these women, these other women. They pay them often much less. I'll give a quick example and then I'll stop talking. On the Upper West Side of Manhattan, it was common for people to have nannies, and nannies especially that were undocumented immigrants. The reason why they preferred undocumented immigrant nannies, as you maybe guess, is that they're able to get the child care services they need at a much cheaper rate. Now, of course, there's no law that says if you hire someone who's an undocumented immigrant, you have to pay them less than a white person who's a citizen. That's a choice that we make. We see someone who's desperate and vulnerable, someone who can't speak up, someone whose labor we can exploit in a way we can't exploit an American, and so we choose to do that. That's a choice. It's not a law. That's not anything that we're forced to do. That's a choice that we make. And it's a choice that a lot of progressive families make. It's how they live their feminist dreams of having two earners out in the workforce is by hiring other women to do domestic labor and shafting them on the pay. Social justice. All right, that's enough out of me.
Thank you for the great talk. So I really like the narrative that basically symbolic capitalists rarely, not often, they metamorphosize into millionaires and billionaires, and the insight that you mentioned about the distribution of the wealth and everything. So, but if I want to play devil's advocate, I would say there is also the distribution of power, which is maybe positively correlated with the distribution of wealth, but it tells a completely different story. Like, for example, if I make $500,000 versus if I make $500 million, in terms of the amount of power I have over the society, over policymakers, over how the regulations are formed, is a huge difference. And even I can say, looking at 1,000 people that make 500,000, so therefore 500,000,000 in combined, still that's huge different amount of power that they have combined versus even one person that makes 500,000,000. And this part was a little bit missing, I think, in your narrative, in the sense that if we are thinking about the future of a country, the future of the planet Earth, how one individual would impact versus 1,000 individual, and we just compare the total wealth, that doesn't necessarily tell the whole story.
Well, again, one of the things that I tried to stress is that even if you look at the richest people in the world, so even if you want to focus on the super elites and look at the absolute richest people in the world, instead of looking at the just merely rich. Again, here's the richest people in America. They're all symbolic capitalists, with the partial exception of Elon Musk, if you want to count him as a traditional capitalist. Jeff Bezos, $197 billion symbolic capitalist, $181 billion symbolic capitalist, and so on and so forth. And so even if you want to look at the super rich, that's us. And again, if you want to look at the people calling the shots, who are the lawmakers and so on, that's us. And so, I take the point, although I don't, maybe it would be a conversation for another time, about how there is a difference in power between what a super elite holds, between the kind of influence that a super elite holds compared to even a bunch of merely rich people. But even if we want to focus on the super elites, we're those people. That's us. They're symbolic capitalists.
I agree that there were maybe symbolic capitalists at some point in their life, but that was very much in the past. And then the metamorphosis into actually completely different form. Maybe actually capitalists at some point. They become millionaires and billionaires.
Well, again,
have changed since they have become that.
Well, I don't think, I think if we just define anyone as a capitalist as whoever as a traditional, they're not traditional capitalists. They don't own the means of, so I mean, they're symbolic capitalists. And not only are they super rich, but again, if you look at their number 2, their number 3, their number 4 as you go down, if you look at the role, the influence that these industries, the industries that they're a part of, exercise over the, as I mentioned, there's like a small number of firms that control like 80% of the real economy. A small number of firms and finance, finance, and so on that control about 80% of the real economy. So I mean, I think it's important if we want to understand who holds power and how power is wielded, to really pay attention to the symbolic industries and symbolic capitalists. I can't see any way around that personally.
We are getting about the time, but not to worry. There is time to keep this conversation going because we do have a reception with an assortment of sugar and caffeine-infused snacks and drinks. It is down in, Linda, remind me the room? It's 16160. Don't worry. Don't just 16136. Don't worry. We'll get you there. Yes, but please join me in thanking Musa Gharbi for the discussion tonight.
Thank you so much.